You're listening to In Good Health, the trusted news source for medicine, science, and technology. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.
I'm Mayan Vasta Betancourt.
And I'm Greg Johnson. This week, why the food industry goes widely unchecked.
We can't have politicians choosing not to do anything about this problem because they see the potential of a nice job later on with Coca-Cola or Nestle.
But first, Europe's disturbing past of medicinal cannibalism.
Every era has a way of normalizing its own madness. And then the big question became not should you eat people for medicine, but what sort of person should you eat for medicine?
All that and more this week on Radio Health Journal. Despite sitting through years of history classes growing up, there's still a lot that doesn't get covered. While some facts of the past have been forgotten, a few particularly grotesque periods have been deliberately kept hidden. One specific time in early modern Europe seems to have set the stage for today's horror stories of vampires and mummies. From the mid-1400s up to the late 19th century, cannibalism reigned as medicine's top remedy. Don't be shocked if this is the first you're learning of it. Dr. Richard Suggs says it's a moment in time people have attempted to erase from the record book.
This was actively whitewashed by medical historians. I mean, they told plain lies about this. They were embarrassed. They were uncomfortable. They claimed that it had been stopped in the 16th century by Ambroise Paré, big French surgeon. He did nothing of the sort. He hated the whole thing, but he said this is the first and last medicine of all our practitioners against bruising and other things. And it was going on very profitably until the time of George III.
Sugg is a historian and author of the book Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires. It details this history of Europeans consuming human bones, blood, and fat. Though it was a popular practice all over, and especially in England, Germany, Italy, and France, the Europeans still looked down upon other cultures, like Native Americans, for similar activities.
People's identity as European white Christians from the 16th century to now, essentially, I suppose, was founded on the idea that they were civilized, that they were not savages, that successively the Native Americans who were slaughtered in genocidal numbers in America well before what we think of as the Native American Indian slaughters. This was going on at the hands of the Spanish in the 16th century. These people were the savages. They ate human flesh. They murdered people to eat them. Actually, all the cannibalism they performed was highly ritual, religious, sober, honorable, respectful, and not like the really down and dirty industrial processing that was going on for medicine in Europe, which would include grave robbing.
Corpse medicine was so pervasive in these societies that it was being practiced at every level of wealth.
One thing you're not taught at school about the Stuart Kings is this. James I refused corpse medicine, although he was probably about the most disgusting monarch that ever lived in Britain, and there's quite a lot of competition for that. Charles II made his own corpse medicine, and he took it in his final illness, which saw him on his deathbed in 1685, and Charles I was made into corpse medicine.
Bones, often the skulls, were ground up into a fine powder to be mixed with various other ingredients to cure epilepsy and migraines. Human fat was often applied on the skin as a salve for bruises, and fresh blood was consumed under the belief that the soul of the dead would transfer into the living.
In Vienna, in Hanover, in many parts of Germany, you could see beheading going on as a standard form of execution. And at this beheading, you would see the executioner's servants with cups, and you would see people, the moment the head was severed, drinking from cups legally and with a small amount of payment, human blood.
For some, it was an umbrella cure. For others, it was an effort to live forever, regardless of the desired outcome. One constant is that people would immediately sprint away after drinking from the victim.
They were trying to circulate the blood around their blood. And this was really the inner logic for most people of probably all of corpse medicine, whether it was bones, skull, organs, flesh, or hot blood. The idea was that you were drinking the soul. So they're trying to circulate this person's soul around their soul, which for them was pervasive. It occupied the whole of the venous and arterial network.
What's interesting is that they most likely were feeling something unusual happening in their bodies, like a burst of energy. However, it wasn't the extra dose of soul power that was causing this reaction. It was most likely iron toxicity from the large quantity of blood they had drank.
And iron toxicity varies along a spectrum from confusion, anger, aggression, convulsions to death, possibly. So these people were feeling, if you like, in our terms, to use modern language, hyperactive, manic. So they were running off this shot of concentrated energy, which the body was taking in.
When people would get their hands on a skull, the common method involved shaving a little off and putting it in a drink. But just like any recipe, it changes over time as more people put their own spin on it.
If you look at the classic recipe for corpse medicine, you'll know that there was a split. You started off with people smuggling Egyptian mummies from Egypt over to Europe and pulverizing this very old, dry, friable body material. And then the big question became not should you eat people for medicine, but what sort of person should you eat for medicine?
One popular idea was that the best skull was from a young, red-headed man who had had a violent death, such as a hanging or drowning, but nothing that involved bleeding out.
And the logic here, as you might guess, is to keep the blood in the body. So what is it about this man? Well, his blood is of a particular type because he's red-haired. His skin looks obviously very fair. And he's young. So even with the logic of modern organ donations, the idea that the organ hasn't been used up, vitality hasn't been used up, his life force hasn't been used up, his blood is all there. And intriguingly, it was believed that you could actually condition the vital spirits of the blood, these spirits of hot blood or breath joins the blood to the soul, the body to the soul. The soul was very much a dynamic, physical, powerful, biological entity. It wasn't a vague, woolly, airy thing that it later became in medical or popular belief.
It was all about power. They believed souls were powerful and that they could harness that power by consuming parts of the body. However, you may have noticed that this idea specifically calls for a male soul. That's because during this time, it was debated if women even possessed a soul at all. And if they did, it was assumed that they wouldn't have much power and wasn't worth going through all of the trouble for. But for many of the remedies, Suggs says they wanted a body that was newly dead, ideally within 3 days and unburied.
Because up to 3 or 4 days, it was dead, but it was only slightly dead. And we're in the minority in thinking that's strange. For most of history, across most of the world, from the time of Christ into the vampire beliefs of the late 20th, so late 19th, probably early 20th century, and some of these were pretty active around the time that Twilight was published, actually. You could be alive, you could be dead, or you could be slightly dead. And in vampire country, you were slightly dead for 3 days, 40 days, a year, these very definite periods.
The belief was that during this period of slightly dead, the soul was smoldering on the body like the last embers in a fireplace and could still be harnessed. This was through the blood, flesh, bones, and in some instances, moss that grew on the skull of unburied bodies. Unfortunately, the Irish rebellion against the English government's expansion was a main source of unburied skulls during this time.
Over in Ireland, when people were being massacred, particularly by a character called Humphrey Gilbert, who was knighted for his pains, there was nobody left to bury them. They slaughtered women and children on the basis that, nobody should be allowed to harbour or feed or help these supposed rebels who were trying to defend their own country. So, how popular was Ireland as a source of corpse medicine until the time of George III? This is around 1770. So next time you see a nice period drama, try and insert this into it. There was a customs tax on human skulls, imported from Ireland to England and then exported again to Germany, which is a very big, very late user of corpse medicine. I think it was 1 shilling per head.
With such a widespread and popular practice, how does Europe move on from corpse medicine, so much so that it's hardly talked about today? Suggs says it was mainly pushed out during the Age of Enlightenment, when reason became regarded higher than religion. This was also accompanied by a lower threshold for disgust.
They start to be referred to as horrid medicines. A strong strain of disgust. Farrago of feculence is a description of the old pharmacopoeias, full of urine and excrement and every type of body part you could imagine. Menstrual blood, sweat, you name it. Sweat of a dying man was one among many. So people got more easily disgusted in the 18th century. If you look at my history of disgust, Talking Dirty, you'll get a big panorama of disgust and how little it mattered and how little it counted, until the 18th century, when people kind of presented themselves, framed themselves as genteel by all the disgusting things they pushed away from them. They were becoming posh, if you like.
And as one ideology got pushed to the side, the era of medicine we know today is what was beginning to take its place. However, it can be argued that in some cases, modern medicine can be just as gruesome.
Just as the corpse medicine stopped, the grave robbing for modern science began. And the result of this was that most people were hugely alienated from medicine all across the world, from Scotland to colonial India to Guatemala in the 1990s. There was a very powerful belief. It was usually wrong, but you could see the logic of it. And the belief was this: there is nothing that the powerful will not do to us, and that includes making us into medicine. John Muir, formidably hardy father of ecology as he would become, was absolutely terrified to death of the black doctors that would seize you on the way home from school in Scotland, stick a patch over your mouth, not to damage the merchandise, and carry you away for anatomy teaching.
To this day, Americans can be paid for giving up parts of their own body, from donating plasma to the very reproductive cells necessary to create human life. And as people back in the 1600s were being murdered for their body parts, today organ traffickers do the same, even selling them to credible hospitals, which was first discovered in 2009.
The number of organ transplants went up exponentially from the late 1990s with very little justification or evidence from where they were legitimately getting the bodies from. So a strange kind of dark labyrinth in which you carry your torch powered by human fat, and you constantly blink at one horrible scene after another, trying to work out which one is true, which one is false. A lot of these beliefs were folk beliefs that people were trying to steal children in Guatemala for their organs and so on. But sometimes this belief that powerful will turn us into medicine is actually true, and probably down to the present day in the very stark, clean, white light of the modern clinic.
Which begs the question: what will make future generations look back at us in disbelief? Which events of the 21st century will they try to hide from their history? Sugg's book, Mummies, Cannibals, and Vampires, is available now. You can find more information about Dr. Richard Sugg and all of our guests on our website, ingoodhealthpodcast.org. For more behind the scenes, follow In Good Health Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.
Coming up, should the food industry be allowed to regulate themselves? When In Good Health returns. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by nutrition in the name of being healthy, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. Last week, Stuart Gillespie detailed how the global food industry manipulates, distracts, and deflects in order to extract the most profit possible from consumers. His book, Food Fight: From Plunder and Profit to People and Planet, explains the shift from food being viewed as a necessity to a commodity, and how it's played a detrimental role in the health of humanity. Luckily, it's not all bad news. Gillespie's outlined a framework that he believes can put us back on track, which he refers to as the 4 Ins. The first is institutions, which calls on governments to focus on providing healthy foods for government agencies, hospitals, schools, and other public establishments, ideally partnering with local farmers. The second branch is incentives, because it's rare that people will go against the status quo just because it's the right thing to do.
Whereby we look at those massive agricultural subsidies, reform them so they're not just prioritizing staple foods, but they also prioritize healthy fruit and vegetables, for example. Taxing harmful substances, not just sodas, potentially going beyond that, looking at different criteria for taxing harmful subsidies, but really importantly, using some of the dividend you get from those taxes to incentivize or improve the access and affordability of healthy diets for low-income families. So you're kind of leveling That's leveling the kind of playing field, if you like, or the food environment.
And then, to help consumers make knowledgeable decisions, the third factor is information. This includes how products are labeled and where that labeling is placed.
Great experience in Latin America with the black octagons. They work, taking away these cartoon characters that are sort of polluting kids' minds about what's healthy and what's not. That's information. Also, dietary guideline committees, making sure they take on the issue of ultra-processing. And then the fourth thing is interest, getting rid of conflict of interest in terms of advisory committees to government, in terms of other bodies and researchers, actually. Researchers that are paid by industry to look at benefits or the harms of products will, not always, not every single one, but in the aggregate, will show a significant systematic bias towards the industry. So that has to be, science has to be independent, it's clear.
Another part of this ideal system is transparency. Gillespie believes that publicly available information needs to be a foundational component of the guidelines put in place. The company's lobbying practices and the reporting of their investment portfolios, sales, and marketing behaviors.
And then there's a revolving door between politicians and corporations that has to be stopped. You know, we can't have politicians choosing not to do anything about this problem because they see the potential of a nice job later on with Coca-Cola or Nestle. So I think all this has to clarify it in terms of the direction and not just the pledges and promises and commitments. We hear them all the time. Action, not words. And therefore, there has to be independent verification of the way in which folios and the investments are changing in companies to prioritize people and planet. There are certain ways that can be done depending to some extent on the corporation and what they're actually doing. But at the moment, what we have is a free-for-all. They can do what they like pretty much.
Some governments have begun to talk about this issue. In fact, the UK published a policy paper on a food strategy for England earlier this year. It aims to build a future where food is healthy, affordable, and accessible. However, this effort has included representatives from a few major food corporations, a choice that Gillespie says will reduce this plan into nothing more than another well-intentioned failure.
On the planning board, we have various large corporations sitting there, and they shouldn't be there. They shouldn't be on the planning strategy development. So we'll see, but some of the same old mistakes of the past seem to be there, but there's a lot of public demand now for much more transparency and accountability.
That doesn't mean there's no spot for industry at the table, but Gillespie argues that they shouldn't be involved until much later in the process.
You don't need industry there because industry it's cross purposes. You have two different purposes there. When you have two different purposes, you pollute the discourse. And the two different purposes are profit and health, if you like. And what we need is people around the table who share the same purpose, the same goal. Industry that can come in later to say, okay, once that's been decided what the strategy looks like, a set of actions to move in that direction, to implement the strategy, then you bring in industry, say, right, you can come and now tell us how you as the industry can best implement or operate with these guidelines and these guardrails to ensure you can make some profit, but also ensure there's healthy and planetary and human is protected.
Despite the overwhelming presence of the current unrestricted system, Gillespie thinks that these parameters will be respected by industry. In fact, once there's a clear set of standards to work within, he believes the companies can once again flourish, just not at the expense of their consumers.
The thing that's happening now is innovation has been driven by the logic of the system that we've had so far. And that means innovation tends to be technological and it tends to be focused on maximizing profit. It's not about improving the healthiness. Once you reset the system, innovation follows a different logic. Innovation will have to say, okay, so it could be social innovation, not just technological innovation. The innovation literally means something new that is beneficial. That will, again, move more towards people and planet, towards human health, towards planetary health than we've ever had before. They're good at that. They have the money to be able to move in that direction. They just don't have any incentives to do that right now because they're making a lot of money out of doing what they've done for the last 15 odd years.
One of the arguments against this innovation, especially in America, is freedom. The ability to operate within a free market where consumers can decide what they want to put in their bodies. If you want to eat ultra-processed food, that should be your decision, no matter how unhealthy it may be. But Gillespie counters that with the historical precedents for government interfering with personal freedom to protect large-scale public health.
Kids can't buy cigarettes. They can't buy alcohol. We have standards of sanitation, all these things have been done to protect public health. The same applies to a junk food, saturated food environment. And that's the role, and it's a large-scale issue, massive issue of human health. That's the role of the government to act to do that. And within that, industry will find its way to survive or not, perhaps. But that's the new world that we're all going to be living in. And it should be a better world with regard to the healthiness of our diets.
Aside from the UK's food strategy, other countries have begun to institute policies that are making progress.
In Chile, there was a great senator, Guido Girardi, who did great things, who brought in the black octagon labels on harmful products or products high in fat, salt and sugar. Colombia is the first country to bring in a junk food tax, not just a soda tax, but a junk food tax. The problem, and there are all the kind of actions that could be done and have been seen to be successful in different places, could be brought together. And I do actually believe that 2 + 2 = 5 when you do this. I think you'd get this interaction effect that is almost always positive. So on top, it's not just additive. So if you have 4 interventions, you do them all at once, it's not just the impact from the 4, you get something else. It's very rarely that you're going to get antagonistic sort of interactions. They're going to be positive interactions. So you have potential to move from vicious cycles to virtuous cycles by doing things together.
So while we're still in the early days of building awareness and creating action, Gillespie is hopeful that we can shift the food industry and craft a system that works with consumers and upholds health standards.
I'm not advocating for banning ultra-processed food. It's about balance. And it will take a while to get there. I'm not naive enough to think these things happen overnight. But in the next 5 to 10 years, definitely we can see some real kind of traction.
Gillespie's book, Food Fight, is available now. You can find more information about Stuart Gillespie and all of our guests on our website, ingoodhealthpodcast.org. For more behind the scenes, follow In Good Health Pod on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our production manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Greg Johnson.
In Good Health returns in just a moment.
Medical notes this week. What's the best diet to boost brain function? A new study in the journal Metabolic Brain Disease reveals that following a low-carbohydrate or low-calorie meal plan was shown to improve brain metabolism in patients with early-stage fatty liver disease. Researchers found that just 2 weeks of this diet slowed cognitive decline and supported long-term brain function. The scientists are now conducting a larger clinical trial to see which dietary interventions make the biggest difference. A new test can reduce barriers to HPV treatment. Human papillomavirus, or HPV, is the greatest cause of cervical cancer. A high number of deaths from this cancer are attributed to delays in diagnosis and treatment. Thankfully, researchers have created a new test that provides accurate results within an hour, which helps clinicians begin treatment faster than ever. The study is published in the journal Nature Communications. Your hometown may be affecting your health. New research has found that where you live may increase your risk for psychotic disorders. A meta-analysis examined multiple countries and discovered that areas with lower income, high crime, and poor quality housing showed nearly 80% higher rates of mental illness. The research is published in the journal Social Psychiatry and Psychiatric Epidemiology. And finally, if you're looking for a boost in health and happiness, it may be time to tie the knot. A new study reports that single people in America and Japan have lower life satisfaction and health than married people. The data includes assessments of psychological and social factors over 2 decades. The findings appear in the journal Personal Relationships. And that's Medical Notes this week. I'm Mayan Vasta Betancourt.
Thank you for joining us this week and every week as we break down the science stories you need to know. You can find all of our past segments and guests on our website at ingoodhealthpodcast.org or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and X for more behind-the-scenes content. Tune in next week for another edition of In Good Health.